Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. So this is the second episode after a long hiatus of the Red Sulphur Podcast. I'm Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmad, and I'm being joined by my friend Habibollah Shahbazi in Shiraz. MashaAllah. And as I said, it's been a long gap between when we first started this podcast back in when I think the lockdown began. And then we all got busy and we had various other things and so on and so forth going on, as often happens. But we are back, and we are going to look at the Kali Yuga in more detail, as well as the Occult War. So the Kali Yuga and the Occult War. Now, in reference to the Kali Yuga, we will point out once again, especially for those who are hearing this term for the first time, that the Kali Yuga as a term applies to the notion of large-scale cycles in human history. And it presupposes a grand cosmological view of things in which time is seen not just as the mere quantitative succession and flow of events, but also in terms of quality. In this regard, I think there is a beautiful quotation which I'd like to share, written by from the words of someone named Keith Critchlow, who was a very important geometer and wrote a lot on symbolism and sacred geometry, and he also wrote a very famous book called Islamic Patterns. But he wrote an introduction, a very brief, actually not introduction, I believe the proper term, Habib, is forward, to this very slim but fascinating, it's not really even a volume, it's more of a pamphlet, it's an essay, it's all of 52 pages in length by Titus Burckhardt, entitled Mystical Astrology According to Ibn al-Arabi. And in that, the foreword of Keith Critchlow, he says, "What is that favorable moment which the Buddha urges us to grasp? Why does he congratulate those who have seized their moment and lament those for whom the moment is past?" The explanation, writes Critchlow, lies in the traditional view of time. Illumination, or the goal of human existence, is instantaneous in relation to the long cosmic journey of passing time. It is a comprehension of reality which comes in a flash like lightning. This favorable moment or paradoxical instant suspends duration and places the recipient into a timeless present. This timeless present is paradoxical, inasmuch as it is qualitatively different from the elusive, profane present that barely exists between two non-entities, the past and the future, and apparently ceases with our death. Neither does the profane experience have any bearing on the prolongation beyond time that the favorable moment brings, which can be likened to a glance outside time. For those of us who have been educated in the values, he puts those in inverted commas, of modern Western industrial culture, the traditional view of time is as difficult to grasp as is its unfoldment, represented by the traditional symbolism of astrology. So we'll have more to say about this notion of a profane time, or the profanation of time, later, but at this point, the key thing to focus on is this traditional symbolism of astrology. So Critchlow is pointing to this notion in traditional thought that every moment has a particular quality. And in that sense, no moment is identical to any other moment. And this is, of course, not the view you have in modern science, where excuse me, time is just seen in its quantitative dimension. It's true, in a given, let's say, 24-hour period, any number of things may transpire, any number of things may happen to any number of individuals on this planet. but the 24 hours of the day are all considered to be the same, 60 minutes in length. Whereas in traditional astrology, for example, there are what you call planetary hours, in as much as each hour or certain interval, which may not necessarily be 60 minutes, is ruled by a particular planet. And these things are well known to astrologers, and mind you, also to people who are involved in the mysteries, and who are involved in theurgy, who are involved in magic as well. And of course, all of these things are considered to be just so much nonsense by the moderns. So in each instant then has a particular quality. And you can have different intervals. You can have an hour, you can have a minute. These are very well-known divisions. You can have a week, you can have a month, a year, a decade, and so forth. And this notion of the Kali Yuga is part of a massive, a huge kind of macrocosmic, or maybe even, I suppose we might even say metacosmic view of temporal reality, in which we have very, very large spans of time. And so there is the notion that there are these 4 yugas. And you find that this is not just an Indic or a Hindu or a Vedic idea. And well, let's not quibble too much on terms. We'll just speak of the Hindu idea, although that term is problematic in some regards. But you will find that akin to this Hindu view, you have a similar idea among the ancient Greeks. And in the ancient Greek idea or terms, we have what's called the Great Year. And it's divided into these 4 ages. And so you have the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the age we are now in, the Iron Age, or as the Hindus would call it, the Kali Age, the age of Kali. So this is kind of the background. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that, Habib? Is there anything like this, let's say in Islamic sources that you've come across, maybe in Persian poetry, which is an area in which you are deeply involved?
Well, there are similar ideas.
I mean, I don't. Is there a similar idea in ancient, Persian Zoroastrian thought? I wonder.
I do not know much about that, but there are certain verses of Ferdowsi which now escapes me, which refers to the cyclical nature of time. But the Nizam is important, which we will mention, I think, later, regarding the title of Lord of Conjunction. But regarding the Greek ages, there's another brief age, the age of the heroes, before the Iron Age, which supposedly was when the Trojan War happened.
True. Now, you just mentioned Nizami, and you, of course, we will come back to him, but we should emphasize that's Nizami Ganjavi and not Nizami Aruzi Samarkandi. There's more than one Nizami. So
Nizami Ganjavi, he was called Aine Ghaib, like it's the mirror of the unseen.
The mirror of the unseen, right.
Paramount importance. In Islamic sources, I always wondered, but this is your area, there are certain brief cryptic references in the Quran, the distinction between awwaleen wa akhareen, such as beginning of Surah Al-Bagha, where it divides people into 3 groups. And the Sabiqun, the foreigners, the elite, it says in the Quran that ثُلَّةٌ مِنَ الْأَوَّلِينَ وَقَلِيلٌ مِنَ الْآخِرِينَ. There were many in the awwaleen وَقَلِيلٌ.
Right. Surah Al-Waqi'ah. You are right.
And also in one of the surahs where Moses is having a debate with Pharaoh, Pharaoh asks him, وَمَا بَالَ الْقُرُونِ الْأُولَى. I think the verse is...
وَمَا بَالُ الْقُرُونِ الْأُولَى, yeah.
And then Moses gives this cryptic reply. He says, وَعِلْمَهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّي. He says, God knows about their...
Yeah, what you know of the people of the earlier ages or centuries, really, Qurun would be centuries, strictly speaking, I suppose. At least that's how we would interpret in modern Arabic, but I suppose it could mean, previous time periods. And he says that, that knowledge is with Allah. Surah Al-Waqi'ah is, I think, Surah 56 in the Quran, for people who don't know. I mean, Muslims just use the name, but I'm just checking here. I think it's 56. And in the what you've referred to, ulaika, it's number 10, verse 10, Surah 56. والسابقون السابقون أولئك المقربون في جنات النعيم ثلة من الأولين وقليل من الآخرين. Right. So the foremost, or those who outstrip, I don't know. They are the ones drawn nigh. They're the ones, presumably who are close to Allah. Fi jannatin na'im, in luxuriant or marvelous, comfort, gardens. Thullatun, a group of them from the ancients, and a small group, or only a few from those who come after. Interesting, yes. So, and what kind of point are you trying to make with that?
Well, I thought this can fit well with the idea that Genon talks about as well. How in the earlier ages they were closer to the truth.
The earlier people were closer to Allah. Yeah.
This idea of quantity and quality. The verse from Ferdowsi now came to me, which refers to the cyclical nature of time. He says,
great.
He says, که گیتی سه پنجه است پر آی و رو کهن شد یکی دیگر آرند رو. There's this mathematical reference which he uses in referring to the Giti, the word sepanj. I don't know exactly how to explain that, but it says how the world por ayuro, there are many comings and goings in it. Kohan shodiki, when it becomes old, they bring a new one. When it becomes old, a new one is brought forth.
Right. Well, also in Al-Waqi'ah, further on in the surah, it's talking about the people of the right hand, Ashabul Yamin, in verse 38, and then in 39 and 40 it says Thullatun min al-awwalin, a few from the ancients, wa thullatun min al-akhirin, and a few of those who come later. So it seems that there are a few who come later in the later ages who will also be the people of the right hand, but as for those who are the foremost, doesn't look like it. So, and Allah knows best, but I'm not sure about this, but in reference to the ancient Persians, unfortunately, I do not have access to a really good academic library where I'm located in the US, but it's such a rare book. I'd be surprised if there was even a copy in even some of the really good academic libraries. But the book I have in mind is that Abu Ma'shar wrote a book on, that's Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, by the way, who was a student of al-Kindi, very important figure in Islamic astrology, and some of his really huge work on astrology, the Greater Introduction to Astrology, has been critically edited in Arabic and translated into English by Charles Burnett, colleague and friend of mine at the Warburg, along with the late and much lamented Professor Keiji Yamamoto, who died just before the book came out. So Abu Ma'shar is a really important figure. Now, that book you can find a PDF of, but there's another book of his, which was done was edited by David Pingree. And it's called Abu Ma'shar's Book of the Thousands. Yeah, Kitab al-Uluf, I think. And if I'm not mistaken, it was many years since I've seen it. Let me do it just sort of, as we say in Arabic, al-kalam yajurru al-kalam. I hadn't thought of this before we actually sat down to do the podcast, but I'm just going to do a quick search. Let's see if there's any. Yeah, now there's been a lot of work done by Benjamin Dykes, and he's translated things, but The Thousands of Abu Ma'shar is what it's called. It came out in 1968 by David Pingree, so you can't easily find this book. I mean, 1968, that's almost yuga away from us, it seems. But I had the good fortune of consulting this book many years ago in the library of the Dominican Institute in Cairo, where I used to live in Cairo. And so I went out there, and so there was a system, just to get to the point, of 1,000-year periods, apparently in what Pingree took to be an ancient Zoroastrian astrological doctrine, which Abu Ma'shar then incorporated into his own system. And Pingree was very critical of this. But suffice it to say that there was some sort of idea of large-scale, shall we say, cyclical periods in pre-Islamic Persian, that's the Zoroastrian astrological tradition. But oddly enough, I don't find this kind of thing later in these in works that I have at least seen in Islamic studies. However, when I say in Islamic, I should have said in astrological works in my investigations in Islamic studies. But once I was reading a rather peculiar book, and it's a weird book for many reasons, but none of them which have anything to do with what we're talking about. Suffice it to say, it's a peculiar book by Nasiruddin al-Tusi. Now, Nasiruddin al-Tusi is a very important figure who died in year 672 of the Hijrah, right? He's a very important theologian, astronomer, astrologer, mathematician, the typical kind of encyclopedic and polymath person, which you find a lot in Islamic intellectual history and not really today very much anymore. So he wrote a book in Persian called Rawzeh Taslim. In Arabic, you would say Rawdat Taslim, but I'm pretty sure that it's written in the Persian form, Rawzeh Taslim, and the book is in Persian. Now, we know that Nasiruddin al-Tusi underwent some sort of an Ismaili period when he was living under Ismaili patronage, and whether he actually adhered to the Ismaili doctrine sincerely or not is impossible really to say at that time, and then whether he changed and went back to 12er Shi'ism or what. But the fact is that he writes this great book in Arabic on 12er Shiite theology, which is still taught in the Shiite seminaries. And he's buried near the Imam Musa al-Kadhim, who is the seventh Imam according to the 12er understanding of things, not the Ismaili understanding of things. So it would seem that he underwent some sort of an Ismaili period. Now, during this work, Rawzeh Taslim is part of the so-called Ismaili period in the curve or the intellectual development of his life. And in that, there is an allusion to just a brief mention to the large-scale cycles of time, the adwar and the akwar. And Allah knows best what is exactly meant by all of this. And there's a similar allusion in one of the writings of Sayyid Hussein Nasr, I forget where, and he also uses the term adwar and akwar, so maybe he was back in the day reading the Rawzeh Taslim, or he picked it up somewhere else, I don't know. But in terms of a full-blown development along the Hindu lines, or the Greek lines, and it's really the Hindus who have a more precise sort of understanding of it, at least as we can discern to the best of my knowledge in the sources, we don't really find a discussion of this among any Muslim thinkers who wrote on astrology, to my knowledge, with the sole notable exception of Abu Rayhan al-Biruni. And listeners who don't know Arabic can have easy access to al-Biruni's book where he wrote this, because it's translated into English. The German Orientalist Eduard Sachau produced a critical edition of al-Biruni's Kitab al-Hind. It's a shorter title. It has a longer, more grandiose title, but generally it's just known as Kitab al-Hind, the Book of India. And that was translated in English, and there's even an abridged edition, and I'm almost certain you can find a PDF, and if not, it is available. It's actually, you can buy it for just pennies almost if you have dollars in India. It stays in print in India, various publishers. So he deals at length with every sort of dimension of Indic or Vedic culture, and he actually went to India, and it's really a remarkable work. And in there, he has a detailed discussion of this whole business of these long periods of time. And there's more than just the Yuga. There's the Manvantara, the Kalpa, and so forth. And all of this is spelled out in in great detail by Abu Rayhan al-Biruni in this very important Arabic work. And that's probably the most detailed that you will find. Besides that, there is the more, there's the modern Indologist, French, actually, he was French, named Alain Danilou. And he has a number of books on Hinduism, and he wrote a book called While the Gods Play, Shiva Oracles and Predictions on the Cycles of History and the Destiny of Mankind. So there also you will find a discussion of this doctrine. I should state, in the interests of full transparency and proper scholarship, that this is a work which I do not own and I have not consulted. I've only seen a few pages of it on book selling sites like Amazon, but there is and I'm looking at that right now, part 5 in the book starts, it's according to this page 189, there is this discussion of the theory of cycles. So basically towards the end of the book, he's got part 5 and 6, the duration of the universe, the 3 cities, predictions, etc. So there is a discussion of it there as well. But in terms of where things are going, people are pretty much have come to an agreement that we are definitely in the Kali Yuga. I don't think that's really ever been disputed by people who are involved in this. It's just the question is, are we near the end of it or not? And if we're near the end of it, what does that mean? So there have been many portents of doom in my own lifetime, and none of them have really come true or come to pass. The most famous one was probably, and most recent was, you remember this whole thing about the Mayans, the Mayan end date in 2012. What do you think that was all about?
Well, if you remember, we had a lot of discussions regarding it, and
Yes.
the general idea was just a lot of confusion and misinformation.
I think there was a lot of confusion and misinformation about that. At the time when it happened, I remember I was still in Cairo. And it was, I think it was, I forget whether it was the 21st or the 22nd. It could be either, depending on where you were on the planet Earth at the time. But basically, it was the solstitial sun, it was winter solstice. And of course, so just for fun, I went out to the pyramids that day and just sat out there while this great 2012 alignment was taking place. And of course, nothing happened. And I was pretty surprised, maybe the Egyptian authorities had cracked down on this. I was expecting to see, like thousands of New Agers and, hippie types and, all sorts of strange things, but there wasn't. There were a few people. And I remember I climbed up on one of the smaller pyramids, which is officially illegal, but, once you get up there, they can't really do anything to you because they're not going to climb up and make you come down. It's just too difficult. And I remember I was sitting up there just watching the sunset, and I saw some people, and they were sitting here and there in lotus position and chanting and doing I don't know what, but the world did not end. So what was happening with this 2012 alignment? I had the good fortune of, I think a year or so prior, to meeting a person who did probably the most research on this Mayan end date, and that's a person named John Major Jenkins. And he wrote a number of books on this, and I'm sure he probably made a good return on them. So he wrote a book on, it was just called 2012 and so forth. So he wrote a couple of books on this. But the most interesting one, I think, for listeners of the podcast is this book called Galactic Alignment: The Transformation of Consciousness According to Mayan, Egyptian, Vedic Traditions. And of course, this is all done with now, right? 2012 has passed, and I actually have an autograph copy. Yeah, so I so it was actually, yes, it was near 2010, so it was about a year before then. There's the autograph. It's dated February 12th, 2010. And so, and I met John actually in Dubai. And then subsequently, he came to Cairo, not on that date because he was leading some sort of tour down to the Mayan site somewhere in the Yucatan, I think, on the actual supposed end date. Though we talked at great length, and oddly enough, we talked while sitting up on one of those pyramids as well, about what was supposed to happen. And he told me some very interesting things. So in short, he said the world really wasn't ending, and what was actually happening when this Mayan end date was that the Kali Yuga was ending. And I thought, well, John, that doesn't sound right at all. I mean, if that's true, then now, mind you, Major Jenkins is not a Muslim, and of course, I was thinking, well, I mean, if that's true, then it's only 2012 or 2011, whenever it was. He came to Cairo sometime after. There's not a lot of time left there for the Mahdi to come and all these things which Muslims believe in. And to be fair, Christians as well. Where's the second coming? Where's all these things that are supposed to happen? Unless, of course, you believe that that's all a bunch of nonsense. And I don't think listeners of this podcast think that at all. So the point is, I said, what do you really mean by this? He said, well, it's not really the end. It's the beginning of the end. I said, really? What does that mean? It means that the Kali Yuga is entering its final phase. And the complete dissolution of things then wouldn't be much too far off. That's what I understood. I hope I haven't misrepresented him or his view. Obviously, he's not here. I lost contact with him. I don't know where he is. But this is what he was talking about. And he explained it further. And he explained it in a very interesting way. And that has to do with what he was explaining had to do with Sagittarius. And here I have a very nice tile showing a representation of Sagittarius made by none other than our friend, our guest, Habibollah Shahbazi.
Actually, I bought it. Not make this.
Oh, I thought you made it, Habib. You bought it. Well, nevertheless, it's fantastic. And as you see in this depiction, you have Sagittarius. He's in Arabic astrology, they call him Al-Rami, or they call it Al-Qaws. In these Indian system, it's Dhanush, which, again, it's a references to archery, and there's a bow. So he's the archer or the bowman. And you see that he's shooting an arrow. Now, in that book I mentioned earlier, from which we started with our quotation from Critchlow, in the particular printed version that I have, the Fons Vitae edition, there are a number of really beautiful illustrations from a 16th century manuscript of the Suwar al-Kawakib by a Sufi. And there again, we have a depiction, beautiful depiction, but in this, the archer is pointing forward, not backward.
Actually, do you know the reason for this?
I was going to ask you to explain, please. Thank you.
Well, the traditional form and the correct form of Sagittarius is, he's shooting forward. And one of the most interesting chapters in the book of your friend is about, in reference to Genon and Kumaraswamy, and apparently unpublished. Yeah, what is Sagittarius shooting at?
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's the traditional form, but this form where he's shooting at his own tail, which is a dragon, this actually referred to an eclipse in Sagittarius. And this reminds me of the, yes, because they show the eclipse, and actually they show the eclipse in if they wanted to show points of eclipse in any sign of the zodiac, they would include a head of a dragon somewhere. Mm-hmm. So a planetary eclipse in Sagittarius was traditionally shown by this sign, but I think after a certain period, this was confused or forgotten, and so there are depictions of Sagittarius in this form as well. But the correct explanation is an eclipse in Sagittarius. So,
and where did you source on that, Habib? Where did you discover this symbolism? Because as
Well,
you know,
it's
whenever
very
there's a
clear.
dragon is a symbol in astrology for the lunar nodes.
Yes, yes, and
North
exactly.
and
And
south.
Sarah
They call it
Cohen,
the head and the tail of the dragon, as you know.
yes, Rahu and Ketu. I remember this marvelous book
Yeah.
where you bought it in Istanbul, The Dragon in Medieval East Christian and Islamic Art by
Oh, is
Sarah
it in
Cohen.
there?
Yes, there's a marvelous chapter there, and let me find the exact
Let me see
reference.
if I can grab my copy while you pull that up.
Yes, it says it's on page 141. It's the dragon on astrology. In Islamic tradition, the planetary eclipse in Sagittarius is generally rendered as a centaur taking aim with a bow at its long dragon-headed tail and shooting an arrow into the dragon's mouth. And there's a marvelous example of it, a sculptural example in a bridge in present-day Cizre. It's Jazira ibn Umar. Now it's in Turkey. And there are astrological depictions there where it shows this.
You said it was page
It's not
145?
Page, yes, page 141.
Oh, yeah, 141.
But there are depictions of this dragon head in other houses as well.
I see. Yeah, it says the pillars of the Tigris Bridge near a sculptural example of the planetary eclipse in Sagittarius is depicted among 8 astrological reliefs carved onto the pillars of the Tigris Bridge near the city of Jazirat ibn Umar, present-day Cizre, I think, in Anatolia.
Yeah, Cizre is a Turkish corruption of Jazira.
Yeah.
But this particular rendition, which you have the title of, this is depicted at the entrance of Isfahan's bazaar in the Meydan in Akhsh Jahan. They call it Sardar Qaysariye. So there are depictions of it on both sides of the arch.
Yes, you've been there.
And this, because Qaus was the Tala, was the ascendant of Isfahan.
I see.
So this became a symbol of Isfahan. Now, I do not know why they depicted it in this way. Was it because there was an eclipse involved? I doubt that. But this is interesting because, as you know, there are.
Well, no, I mean, this whole dragon is thought of as the so-called eclipse monster, right? Yes. And relationship with the eclipse. And there's a lot of information here in this book on this by Sarah Cohen. And again, Al-Biruni makes an appearance here on page 40, as does Abu Ma'ashar, but this is all getting into a lot of detail. What is, to stay on the point, so this is the book, The Dragon in Medieval East Christian and Islamic Art, but the point I was trying to make is that John Major Jenkins, he asks the question, what is it that the archer in Sagittarius is actually aiming at? What is he pointing at? And it turns out that A.K. Kumaraswamy, or A.K., surely it looks like it's Kumaraswamy, but it's Kumaraswamy, Anand Kentish Kumaraswamy. He was a very prolific traditionalist, author with a capital T, and wrote on many, many subjects, and there's been different collections of his writings, but there is a work which was never published. And John Major Jenkins got a hold of this. It's called Early Iconography of Sagittarius. And it's in the Princeton University archives and is not dated according to the bibliography of Galactic Enlightenment, page 286, the second entry down. It says early 1940s. I have never been able to get a hold of this, even though I just haven't had a chance to visit my alma mater and get in there. I mean, I have lifetime access as a graduate of university, and you just have to, fill out the paperwork and they let you in, and you can request stuff from the archives. But I'd be very interested in reading that, but I have not been able to do so. But the summary, which is there in John Major Jenkins' book, Galactic Alignment, says that what the archer is actually pointing to is the galactic center. And this is very important. And he says that this was a very ancient esoteric doctrine, namely of the revolution of the sun around this center, the galactic center. So the sun pulling the whole solar system along with it. And of course, this whole idea that the ancients believed the world was flat and all sorts of things, and this is complete nonsense. And similarly, the heliocentric doctrine was also something which was known, but it was something of an esoteric doctrine. It wasn't widely disseminated or made public. And even among ancient Greek astronomers, astrologers, you have this idea associated with Aristarchus of Samos. And there's actually a lengthy sort of study of this heliocentric idea in the ancient world by a Dutch mathematician and historian of astronomy astrology named Van der Waerden. So that's also out there. And so these ideas were known to a kind of intellectual elite. And so what this is referring to, the Mayan end date, is the completion of a whole revolution around the galactic center. And that this would be taking place, around the time of the winter solstice sun of 2012. Now, there is some problem with the timing, and John also looked into this, the timing of that as being 1998, 2012, 2020, 2040, which is interesting. So you have to remember that we're not talking about dimensionless points moving around other dimensionless points on an orbit, whether circular or elliptical, which is based, so it's a curve which has no width. The sun is a very large physical body, to state the obvious. And then also, how do you understand what the galactic center is? Well, the galactic center is located in Sagittarius, right? When we say something is located, it doesn't mean it's actually physically there. It's like when you look up, that's where you would see it, if you could see it. Anyhow, the point, that's what it is aiming at. And so you have to imagine you've got this big ball that's coming into alignment with another large area in space. And so apparently this alignment started happening in 1998. And so even 2012 is a kind of an approximation, I suppose. Anyhow, so that's how he explained it to me. So what we're really talking about is the alignment of the solstice meridian with the galactic center, galactic equator. And there are a lot of good diagrams in this book. So in that sense, the book is still quite good and relevant. Excuse me.
He also mentions this, how the exaltation of the head of the dragon is also in Sagittarius.
Yes.
The Jawzahar, Ra'sa Jawzahar, as the exaltation of the tail is in Jawza, it's in Gemini.
So there's some other dates as well that relate to this galactic alignment. But they're far off. 2220, 2240. So who knows what all of that means. So the point is that presumably we are now in the ending phase. So there's a descending phase of the Kali Yuga and the ascending phase of the Kali Yuga. So apparently we reached rock bottom somewhere around 2012, according to this interpretation. And now things are on the up in that they will get worse only to get better. Because after the end of the Kali Yuga, if you believe in this whole doctrine of cyclical history, then the whole system resets, right? And starts all over again. Now there are some, there's a question about dating here. And there's a lot of very good work that has been done on this by Robert Bolton in his book, The Order of the Ages. And I think we did speak about this a little bit in our earlier podcast, in which we talked about the Kali Yuga. So there are some important symbolic numbers involved in this calculation. One of them is the symbolic quantity of 432,000 years. So there's 432,000, but you can drop the zeros as well and get 432. 432,000 is 540 times 800. You find these numbers a lot in ancient mythology, in the Icelandic Eddas, the Ragnarok, for example, where the powers of darkness overwhelm the gods. The number of combatants who are there on the field of battle is 540 times 800, which is 432,000. So what does this number have to do with things? Well, it has to do with the respective lengths of the yugas in the Indian sources. So the quantity, the number 432, with any number of zeros after it, always comes up. So according to René Guénon, the long cycle, a world cycle, is called a Manvantara, or era of Manu. And he's India's original lawgiver, the author of the Manu Dharam Shastra, And it seems, according to Guénon, that this is the same as the Roman Numa and the same as the Greek Minos, these ancient lawgivers. But the point is that the length of a Manvantara is 432 followed by 4 zeros, which would make it, let's do this right, 4,320,000 years. Okay? But this Manvantara is further divided into 4 smaller groupings, and those are the yugas, which correspond in ancient Greek to the ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. But the Indian chronology assigns a symbolic period of time to each of the 4 yugas. So to get that symbolic period of time, you have to use 432,000. So the first yuga, the Treta Yuga, is 4 times 432,000, which is 1,728,000 years. The next yuga, which is the Treta Yuga, which would correspond to the Silver Age in Greek, is 1,296,000, which is equal to 3 times 432,000. Then the Dvapara Yuga, which would be the Bronze Age, is 864,000 years, which is 2 times 432,000. Finally, the Kali Yuga is just 432,000 because you multiply it by 1. So the shortest yuga is the Kali Yuga, and it's 1/10 the length of the total cycle. So this 432 is important. You have 4321, and this is the ancient Pythagorean tetractys, because 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 equals 10. So there's this notion that 4, 3, 2, and 1 are in a sense the equivalent of all numbers because they combine to produce the decad. Now you can further divide these things down. So if the Treta Yuga itself is divided further into its own golden age and silver and bronze and iron using the ratio 4, 3, 2, 1, you end up with 172,800 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 to get the different lengths of each of the sub-yugas within the so-called Treta Yuga. So you continue in this fashion, reducing all of this, and then you come up with possible durations for each of these yugas. So the Kali Yuga, in short, according to this method of calculation, comes down to the following. And these are approximate. In other words, from 3102, 3102 before Common Era, to 2082. Or if you like, 3102 BC to 2082 AD. And you can further divide those out, but that is sort of the prediction that he comes up with as the time of the end. So it would seem that there are only, what is it going to be? 62 years approximately left. If you believe that. That may be true, may not be true. Now, there's also some other weird predictions going around. A lot of people are talking these days about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that is again coming up. Once again, just like the 2012 end date, around the same time, namely the winter solstice. So it's going to be December 20th or 21st. I mean, it'll happen whenever it happens, and what the date and the time will be, well, it depends on where you are on the Earth. But there is a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, and these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions have always been considered very important by mundane astrologers, by astrologers who look at these larger cycles, and are supposedly references to huge changes that are going to take place. The thing is that there's a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction about every 20 years. And so, but people are getting really excited about this one because there is a change of sign taking place. So this one is when it's December. So universal time, or GMT, it'll be at 1822 GMT on December 21st. Jupiter and Saturn will be in the same degree, that is to say at 0 degrees 29 minutes of Aquarius. The last time this there was a conjunction was on May 28th, year 2000, at 1605 GMT at 22 degrees and 43 minutes of Taurus. I'm referring to the Tables of Planetary Phenomenon, 3rd edition, by Neil F. Michelson, copyright 2007, by Starcrafts Publishing in New Hampshire. I have some very good tables there of these conjunctions. So there is a very well-known way of dividing up the signs in astrology by element: fire, earth, air, water. And so each astrological sign is either fiery or earthy or airy or watery, or is considered a fire sign, an earth sign, air sign, or a water sign. And Aquarius is an air sign. And the previous conjunction, as I said, was in the year 2000. It was in Taurus. That's an earth sign. So these astrologers are of the opinion that this represents a huge change, because we're going into a new triplicity, as it's called. Well, whether that's true or not, I really don't know, because in 1981, so it's, like I said, it's about every 20 years. In 1981, there was another Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and it actually happened twice, and that can happen because sometimes these planets go retrograde and come back. Retrograde is the apparent backward motion of a planet, and they really don't move backwards, but it seems like they do because of the different amounts of time that it takes to go around the sun. And that can be so because the Earth is closer, and then it moves in its orbit around the sun, so it looks like Jupiter or Saturn has been left behind, and it seems to be moving backward. What all it really means is that Jupiter is moving slower, relatively speaking, to the sun, and so there's this apparent backward motion. And those conjunctions happen in the sign of Libra, which also is an air sign. So I'm not really sure what all of the hype is about. I heard somebody saying, well, the last time this happened, it was like 240 years. Well, it doesn't, not according to these tables. So I don't know if this is such a big deal. It's odd that The great medieval astrologer Nostradamus also had some sort of a prediction. He did use astrology to make his predictions, it would seem, but it's not always obvious how he's doing it. And there's this peculiar book which I read many years ago called The Nostradamus Code by David Oveson. And I remember reading about some prediction he made for 2020, and I thought, oh, okay, we'll see. So here we are. So let's just see what he had to say about 2020. Yeah, on 21st December 2020, he says the two planets, Saturn and Jupiter, so important in predictive astrology, will conjunct in the first degree of Aquarius. This is on page 443 of the Nostradamus Code by David Oveson, copyright 1997, published by Arrow Books, New York. So he says something pretty strange here. He says that these two planets had not been conjuncted for over 800 years. Now, I'm not sure what he means by that because they conjunct every 20 years, so maybe he means an Aquarius. But again, if you check the tables, it's not really 800 years. I'll refer to the tables here. Let's see. Conjunctions in Aquarius. Yeah, so there was one in 1405, January 25th. At 23 degrees 46 minutes of Aquarius at 20:06 GMT. There was a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius on March 12th, 12:26 at 4:28 GMT, 2 degrees 58 minutes. That's the only one that's comparable in as much as it's being the early degrees of the sign of Aquarius. So wallahu a'lam, Allah knows best. And Oveson says something really strange. He says that there will be 57 years of lasting peace starting in 2020. I don't really know what that means. It's not like we've been in a war, unless you consider the so-called war on terror to be a war. There's all sorts of wars in that sense of cold or passive wars going on all the time. But there hasn't been a kind of shooting war of the kind of the cataclysmic, massively destructive ones like the Second World War, or even what are some other recent conflicts? Vietnam comes to mind. The Soviet Union's involvement in Afghanistan comes to mind. Of course, at any given time, the U.S. is involved in all sorts of military actions around the world. It's the world's largest sort of military power. It is a de facto empire. There's probably somewhere almost 800 military bases. I once heard a figure of 700 and something, but those were, someone made a listing. In fact, I heard that on Habib. I heard that years ago on Press TV. So, but similar figures, 700 plus, getting well beyond 750 have also been quoted by, I think RT and other these so-called, alternative stations. But those are just the known bases. And, the U.S. is involved in Syria. The U.S., for all we know, might be, running around, has these troops in any number of places. Djibouti, they may well be in Ukraine. They may even be out there in your neck of the woods, Habib, in Iran, moving around. Who really knows? There's a whole sort of secret army of the CIA, which isn't declared, which means we have no idea, other than the people who are involved in that intelligence operation, what's going on. And the U.S. also has its Secret Armies of NATO, a very important book on that. So there's always stuff going on. And in that sense, it is occult in the sense that it's hidden. Hidden in the sense that it's not really known, widely known. People like you and me, we read a lot of books, and, we sort of have some idea that there's any number of covert military operations going on at any one time. And not to single out the U.S., China is doing it, the Soviet Union is doing it, all these big powers are involved in very murky military goings on all over the world, drones and God knows what, right? But when we talk about the occult war, we don't really mean that, do we? So what do we have in mind? How would you explain this concept of occult war, which is really the second sort of thing that we want to get into now?
Of course. And before we get into that, I remembered an excellent book by Henri Corbin on this doctrine of ages, and it's a
Oh,
book
great.
called Cyclical Time and Ismaili Gnosis.
Spiritual, what is it?
Cyclical Time and Ismaili Gnosis. This is the English title as is given by this in this Persian translation by
Oh, yeah,
Inshallah
yeah. Zaman Advari, or what is it? Oh,
در
no, Zaman Advari. I
مزیدها.
can't see it. Oh.
Yes. And as you know, he doesn't use the term Zartushti, he uses the term Mazdisna because
Yeah, that's what I saw. He didn't use Zarathushtri. Why does he do that? Well, so what you mean is the English, the actual book is Cyclical Time in Ismaili Gnosis.
and Mazdaism, because Zoroastrianism, it was a very plural, there are many forms of it. So
That's right.
he uses Mazdaism, and there are many interesting topics. And he mentions Nasiruddin Tusi and Ismailis, as you know, and they have all these sorts of fascinating diagrams,
I don't remember that because I think, whoever translated that into Persian must have added a lot of notes because that's a big book you've got there.
Yes.
And the English book is a slim volume.
Yes, Inshallah, Ahmad, he does an excellent job and he has very learned commentaries and writings. So, I mean, you've read about this. There are frequent mentions of Hejda Hezar Alam, 18,000 words in
Yes.
poetry and writings, in Sufi writings. And there are even hadiths of them. Imam Sadiq says, which Adam do you mean? God created thousands and thousands of Adam, and we are in the last age. This also refers that, there have been many Adams and many worlds and many repetitions of this.
Yes, that's true.
And maybe you can elaborate on that further. But the occult war, the thing that always comes to me is that, this is how many books of Shia Hadith begin with, the idea of aql versus jahl, intellect or higher intelligence versus ignorance.
Yeah.
And how this, as above, so below, this is the essential, to break it down to the essentials, to the principles. This is the true meaning of the occult war, and it goes on inside the heart of every human being. And the outward conflicts are just shadows of the shadows, or just manifestations of that. And if one is not careful, and the priority of Batan over Zahir, if one is not careful of the internal battle, and presumes that one is perfect without analyzing every day one's actions by philosophy, by logic, one can easily travel the path of joining the side of ignorance and jahl. And one sees many sad examples of that in individuals and movements in modern times. So one often sees opposing sides who are essentially in their batin, in their action, they are the same. There's no difference between them.
Yeah.
And Nizami mentions this, so we have to look at the batin. Nizami mentioned when he's describing in his book on Haft Peker, the tale of the 7 icons or 7 princesses. There's a story there which is part of the story cycle of Wednesday, Mercury, when he's describing the demons, and he says that their characteristic is that راستخوانی کنند و کج بازند، دست گیرند و در چه اندازند، مهرشان رهنمای کین باشد، دیو را عادت این چنین باشد. He says they tell the truth, راستخوانی کنند, but their actions are wicked, twisted, so you know them by their actions. They take one's hand, but they throw one in the well. Their love is a guide towards hatred, and this is the habit of demons. And this reminds me of a fragment of Corpus Hermeticum, part 7, where it says, where it's all about how the greatest evil in mankind is ignorance, jahl, concerning God. And it says, first you must rip off the tunic that you wear, the garment of ignorance, the foundation of vice, the bonds of corruption, the dark cage, the living death, the sentient corpse, the portable tomb, the resident thief, the one who hates through what he loves and envies through what he hates.
Yes.
This inversion of love. So, and all of these esoteric philosophical writings emphasize that this metaphysical internal struggle.
Mhm.
And again, if this is not observed, the path, one doesn't become an ignorant one over a day. It's a process, it's a path. And one sees, like, as I said, individuals and movements who forego the priority of the internal struggle, the Hajj Akbar, the greater pilgrimage, which is pilgrimage of the heart, the greater jihad, the internal, and their whole edifice rots from within, and only a facade remains, and then the facade falls apart. So there are all of these outside conflicts, but many sides, oftentimes, they're essentially the same, again, in their actions. And those who understood the importance of the internal struggle, we have examples of that, this idea of chivalry, characters who had, this idea of, in Persian, we say, jang bedun nefrat, war without hatred, which also exists in the samurai, in the Bushido code.
Yeah.
People like the most recent example, Ahmad Shah Massoud in Afghanistan, or Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, or Salahuddin, who even their enemies praised them. And of course, there are plenty of examples from the opposing side. Most of the struggles are like that. So this has always been of more interest to me than the outward appearances of this struggle. And as you know, you can explain this, how looking for, actors on the actual scene, who are the counter initiation, and this has a very murky and dark and ugly history. Those who focus too much on finding actors on the world stage.
That's absolutely fascinating. You've touched on a number of important points, and I think you put it beautifully when, in reference to the hermetic dictum of as above, so below. And I think that this is a very important ishara, or pointing to the correspondence of the microcosm with the macrocosm. And one reason that there is so much disorder and chaos in the external world is because we have the same thing in the majority of humanity. So there is upheaval in the external world because there is upheaval in the majority of human souls who populate the earth in this cycle, and at this point in the cycle of the Kali Yuga. And indeed, what is found in the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salatu wassalam is very profound in the Kitab al-Kafi, the book of the sufficiency, and it's the 14th hadith that talks about the junud al-aql wal-jahl, or the legions of the intellect, or if you like, the intelligence, and the legions, or armies even, you could say, of ignorance. And it's a very famous hadith, and it goes back to the 6th Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, who talks about these junud al-aql wal-jahl. I don't know that there's any translation of this in the English language which I could endorse. There are a couple of translations, but they're pretty bad. But suffice it to say, there is this idea confirmed by the Islamic Shīʿah doctrine of an ancient struggle between good and evil. And so that's confirmed here in this hadith. And there are a lot of people who talk about this group or that group that is really behind world events. And if you honestly believe what is said there in the so-called mainstream media outlets, then you're very naive. I mean, most of this is just bread and circuses and has very little to do with what is actually going on. But then there are levels and within levels. It's like the peeling this through the skins of an onion. And so if you, in the case of the United States, I mean, if you really believe that this national pantomime that takes place every 4 years actually means something, and that you vote and this and that. So there's this whole illusion that people buy into of democracy. And it's very clear that, there are very powerful interests that actually dictate what goes on, and very little really changes. And so often people fall into this whole sort of right-left dichotomy, which is very interesting because it reminds one of the Sephirotic tree from the Kabbalah, the right and the left. And so you have the left-wing types who say, well, it's just these large corporations, these mega corporations, and the mega corporations control the state, and then they get involved in this whole Marxist dialectic and so forth. And then you have even more exotic sort of ideas that it's the Illuminati, it's the Freemasons, it's the Jews, it's the Catholic Church. So there's all sorts of theories, and I'm not going to use the word conspiracy theory because that's a way just of shutting down discussion. It's very much a term of condemnation. Conspiracy in the linguistic sense of the term does take place in history. There are individuals, parties, and groups that work together. That's what conspire means. It comes from a Latin root meaning to breathe in unison. That certainly has, those sorts of cooperations certainly do take place in human history, and they have. But what exactly is going on is another matter, and what's going on right now is a whole other matter. So it's very easy to fall into these kind of thought patterns, for want of a better term. And of course, the more, and it gets stranger and stranger. So there's the talk of the UFOs, extraterrestrials, the Anunnaki, reptilians, and all sorts of things. But I do think that there is something to the idea that there is more to what is going on than meets the eye. And so there is some sort of a struggle between good and evil, but what exactly it is hard to put your finger on in exact terms. And I do think that there is some sort of an organized body of individuals that is responsible for much of the chaos and so forth that we see around us. It's too well ordered. In the realm of metaphysics and theology, I am not really an advocate of what is known as the design argument for the existence of God. So if you just in brief, the design argument as well, we see so much order and so forth in the world, therefore there has to be a God. So I'm not too convinced about that argument. I, of course, do believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I favor other arguments, and I have given lectures and spoken about this on many occasions. But when you talk about the existence of evil in the world, and you see, and I've lived all over the world, I've lived in many different countries, and I have seen a great deal. And it leads me to believe that this whole thing is just a little bit too well organized. It, in other words, isn't random. And there really is no randomness in history. I'm not a materialist. If you're a materialist, then history is just one damn thing after another. But if you understand things, there are the workings of providence. And then begs the question, well, if that's true, then why doesn't God directly intervene in history? Why is there evil? So on. These are other discussions. But in brief, temporally speaking, the further and further that we get from the origin, from the principle, the more that the chaos has to increase. And there's the notion of the principle of plenitude as well, in as much as that if there is a certain possibility which is not contradictory to itself, it must be realized sooner or later. And so that is what we witness in the unfoldment of these yugas. So from the golden to the silver to the bronze to the iron, there will be a coming down, an increase in entropy, if you want to use a term from modern physics. But by entropy here, I don't mean in the sense, I'm just using it as a symbol. I don't mean in the sense of the overall disorder in a thermodynamic system, but the overall disorder and chaos in the original Greek sense of the term, moving toward chaos, cosmos dissolving, there's a kind of dissolution, a deliquescence into chaos as we move further and further away from the principle. And I see that as being organized, that there are certain forces which are at work behind that. And in this regard, there's some interesting remarks made by Robert Bolton in his book, The Order of the Ages. Where he talks about these things. All right. So he's talking about in chapter 6, cosmic descent in Western tradition under the subheading The Four Mythical Ages. Possibly from an analogy with the four seasons, there is a universal myth which teaches that the world began with a golden age, which was followed by ages of silver, bronze, or brass, and iron. The qualities of these metals were understood as symbols of the prevailing qualities of the four ages and have no connection with the bronze and iron ages of archaeology, which simply result from the periods when these metals came into general use. The sequence of ages involves the idea of a certain constant deterioration of the world which man cannot prevent, at least on the collective scale. So there is no amelioration or progress in history. It's actually a coming down. The Golden Age is said to owe its quality to that of the beginning of the world when nature and the supernatural were still in harmony, and all things had the fullest degree of perfection possible for them. Among its sources in Greek literature, it appears in the poetry of Hesiod, in his a famous poem called Works and Days, who wrote in the 8th century BC. A fifth, as you rightly said it earlier on in the podcast, or heroic age is added by him to the four between the ages of bronze and iron, but it does not alter the picture of decline from the original state of the world. There's also this idea that with the coming of the Kali Yuga, and with each age going after one after another, the lifespan of the human being declines more and more, and so much so that the people of iron, it calls them the race of iron. Hesiod says that they will so degenerate that even the newborn will bear the marks of old age, until finally Zeus, destroys the world. It's also mentioned in Plato and his dialogues. It's a very ancient traditional doctrine. Bolton argues that it's there in biblical doctrine as well. Also in the Hermetica, you mentioned the Corpus Hermeticum, beautiful quotation from the thrice great Hermes.
I may add, in the Sumerian king lists as well, and the Chinese king lists as well.
Yes.
From before the flood, they give this, they call the mythical ages. Such a king ruled for 20,000 years, 10,000 years. These extraordinary numbers.
Very extraordinary. I'm just looking for another quotation here. All right, this has to do with a reflection on the relationship between microcosm and macrocosm, as above, so below. There's a fascinating quote here from the Russian thinker Nicholas Berdayev, and he's actually writing about, I think, art, because I haven't seen this book, but the footnote is referring to a book called The Meaning of the Creative Act. Are you familiar with this book, Habib?
Roughly.
Roughly, yeah. I haven't read it, but this is an interesting quote by Bolton on page 82. He says, "Man is a small universe. That is the basic truth for knowing man, and the basic truth which precedes the very possibility of knowing. The universe may enter into man, be assimilated by him, be attained and known by him, excuse me, only because in man there is the whole component of the universe, all its qualities and forces. Because man is not a fractional part of the universe, but an entire small universe himself. Man and the cosmos measure their forces against each other as equals. Knowing is a conflict between equal forces rather than being a dwarf and a giant." Very interesting, this notion of the interpenetration of the large world, the great world and the small world, so to speak, the great and the small. And Imam Ali alayhi salam also in his the first Shia Imam in his Diwan has this statement: أتزعم أنك جرم صغير وفيك انطوى العالم الأكبر. You wrongly think that you are a tiny world, but the entire greater order is contained within you. And it's interesting that in Islamic philosophy, when you encounter people like Mullah Sadran, he defines what Islamic philosophy says. He says one of the definitions, I'm just paraphrasing off the top of my head. I mean, I could pull it up. It's at the beginning of the Kitab al-Asfar, volume 1 of 9 of the Four Journeys, his famous book, The Four Journeys. He says that philosophy really is to make your soul, your inner world, conform to and reflect the outer world. So I think that's absolutely fascinating. And Bolton comments on this at length, and he says, because this conception, in other words, of the interpenetration of the great and the small, the macrocosm and the microcosm, mentioned by Berdayev in The Meaning of the Creative Act, he says, because this conception is so often not understood, with its implication that the humanly experienced world is a private representation in each soul, the unimaginable quantities of the universe can appear as a threat to the significance and even to the reality of the individual. The endlessness of outer space, in which the earth is but a point, the eons of time, and the incalculable number of souls that have been embodied, that have had embodied lives, may astound the imagination. But for all that these quantitative magnitudes are logical inferences and are never directly experienced or even experienceable. He goes on, the individual human state is at the center of all these macrocosmic realities in a much more profound sense than that of spatial centrality. The metaphysical truth in this was once conveyed to mankind by Ptolemaic astronomy, with its geocentric description of the universe, and it stood for something much more profound than a supposed need to enhance human feelings of self-esteem. Now, many people may not like this statement, but the fact remains that the Ptolemaic system as a symbolic system is a very profound kind of cosmological understanding of things and of the relationship of the divine will to the world. He goes on saying that in the Copernican revolution, this was replaced by a technically more effective model, but one which obscured the truth of man's relation to his world. But regardless of the prevailing theory, the quantities proper to the spatial and temporal world are present in each consciousness in a mode that makes them intelligible to us. So you have to understand that the macrocosm and microcosm are two dualities, but they point the way, he says, to a third reality. And that third reality creates an equilibrium between the macrocosm and the microcosm. In this case, this third reality, Bolton tells us, would be a greater macrocosm, a metacosm, he calls it, which would comprise, that is to say, include the macrocosm and the grand total of all the representations of it realized in individual beings. So he's saying that, yes, each person is a microcosm, but that they reflect the macrocosm in different ways and in different degrees, which goes well with what Mullah Sadra says in his definition of philosophy. So on this basis, the real world, Bolton says, would then be in effect a community of spirits, rather as Leibniz, the great German philosopher, conceived it. Such an enlarged and spiritualized idea of the macrocosm makes it easier to understand, and this is the key point, makes it easier to understand the mutually corrupting and conversely mutually regenerating roles ascribed to microcosm and macrocosm. And he's referring to an earlier debate which took place in history in Britain between theology and the modern sort of understanding of philosophy. And the debate had to do with whether there's actually progress in human history or not. And the early, it was in the 17th century actually. So the 1600s, there was this. That's when this notion that that history actually involves progress, rather than an entropic winding down, was challenged. So this kind of interaction is very important. This what did I say earlier? The mutually corrupting and conversely mutually regenerating roles that we have in microcosm and macrocosm. And this also comes out in the quote from Berdayev, or in the work of Berdayev in the same book, The Meaning of the Creative Act, when he says, the destinies of the microcosm and macrocosm are inseparable. Again, Hermetic doctrine, as above, so below. They rise or fall together. The condition of the one is imprinted upon the other. They mutually penetrate each other. Bolton explains this very nicely when he says that because of the mutual interpenetration of the great and the little worlds, the corruption of man has its effects on the physical processes of his world, so that much more is involved than questions of personal and social value. So he's referring after this to the Bible, the biblical account of the fall, where the earth, according to the biblical doctrine, is said to be cursed because of Adam, so that it loses much of its fertility. Now, I'm not sure how well this actually fits in, because it depends on what you understand by Adam. And like you said in the Shīʿah doctrine that there were many Adams. Which Adam do you mean? Because if history begins with the first Yuga, the Treta Yuga, then that's a paradise. There is really no need to till the soil to create furrows in the earth and plant. Agriculture would come later. And you know how that all happened is just so impossibly hard to know, because it was so long ago. We have no written records. We have myths. We have some sort of historical memory in perhaps encoded in those myths. You know, some people believe in a notion of a collective unconsciousness, which was argued at length by Jung. I'm not convinced of this idea of there being a collective unconscious. I do think that there something else called Ayan al-Thabita and Ibn Arabi, but that's a whole other discussion, you know, the Platonic ideas. But there are very, very long periods of history, whether you believe in the doctrine of the Yugas or not. And it's very hard to say what happened in them. And you know, there are a lot of people now who talk about the role of catastrophe in history, the roles of massive cataclysms which have cut off our historical memory of those earlier periods, and it's very hazy in the form of maybe some vaguely remembered and understood myths. One of the most interesting people in this regard, and also one of the most controversial, was Immanuel Velikovsky, when he wrote his famous book, you know, Worlds in Collision, Ages in Chaos, things like this. But there have been others since then. There's a very interesting thinker, and I would recommend, is very accessible. He's made a lot of videos. I think he's probably independently wealthy. I don't know how he's made these, or he's had good funding. Someone named David Talbot, The Saturn Myth. So he has a whole website and YouTube channel called the Thunderbolts Project, in which he talks about, he spent his life studying various myths. He was inspired by Velikovsky, that in previous ages, Saturn was the main god. It's Kronos, not Zeus. And he has this notion that the solar system was very different in remote antiquity, and that the planet Saturn, Venus, and Mars were all aligned in a certain way and were in fact visible from the Earth. And Saturn was given this role as the great god, and then Mars had a role and Venus had a role. And it's kind of a weird theory when you hear me saying, but if you actually listen to what he has to say in his film, he actually wrote a book called The Saturn Myth, but it's out of print and you can't find it. It was written something like 40 years ago, around 1980. So 2 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions ago, approximately. And he says that the main factor, really, as a physical force, or force is the right word, or phenomenon, really, or parameter in understanding planetary physics is not gravity, but electromagnetism, and especially what is called what's known as the fourth state of matter, or plasmas. And so he has this whole doctrine of the electric universe and so forth. So I don't want to go into all of that, but suffice it to say that he has argued that at length, and in a very engaging and entertaining way. His films are very well made, very professional, and so you can go and watch them. There's a lot of them talking about all this. So what exactly happened? There is some sort of a fall, right? And human beings then have to struggle. They have they have some sort of a time on this earth. That's there very much in the monotheistic religions. There are select passages in the Quran that indicate this as well, that Adam is being sent down, that they have to put in a certain amount of toil and effort for their sustenance on this world. At any rate, Bolton says in another place on page 84, when it is said that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, this does not mean that it has a purely passive function, like that of a mirror. On the contrary, the formation of the reflection or representation results from the soul's constant flow of volition. But although the soul is essentially activity, the direction of this activity is liable to vary in the manner of the symbolic circles or circulations described by Plato in the Timaeus, and in the passage quoted in the previous chapter, which obviously we didn't read. This comparison with clockwise and anti-clockwise motion highlights the idea that the microcosm's creative energies can be deployed either in harmony or disharmony with the normative cosmic motion. In theory, these considerations would allow no more scope for the degeneration of the world than for its regeneration, since the mutual influence for good or ill by the great and little worlds need not imply an excess of one influence over the other. The miraculous powers attributed to saints manifest the positive potential of this possibility, and in them the macrocosm is raised to its highest potentiality in anticipation of its ultimate redemption. But while the regenerative process never actually ceases, the balance of forces tells increasingly against it over the greater part of history, simply because numbers are not on the side of those who follow the regenerative way. So yes, you can take up a path of dignification of your soul, of ascesis, but how many people do that? How many people really who are involved in religion are truly religious? Now, there was an interesting book many years ago written by a Tibetan meditation master named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and had a very nice title, and it's just talks which he gave, but they're very interesting, and the title says a lot. It's called Spiritual Materialism, meaning that most people who are involved in religion are involved in it in a kind of materialist way, in a kind of exteriorization, outward rituals, a kind of hypocritic spiritual superiority game, a kind of psychological game. And that is what we witness. So even though that there are individual acts of kindness and a profound concern and profound piety and people who are involved in ascetic disciplines and contemplative disciplines, it's the minority, and the overall flow again is in the direction of dissolution and entropy, greater entropy. So what are among the obstacles to people accepting this idea, according to Bolton? He says that the main reason for this, the main barrier, against such insights is the near universal belief that the human mind relates to its world only in the way of a piece of photographic film to its objects. This belief is a result of ignorance of the creative power of the human state and of the fact that even the simplest perception does not arise without the application of a mental act to it, similar to that of reading a word or decoding a symbol. The world of experience results from the activity of the individual mind in concert with all other human minds together. And while the world in itself is not created by the individual mind, nor even by the sum total of them, it is nevertheless conditioned by the latter to such a degree that the moral, intellectual, and aesthetic development of mankind as a whole has a cosmic significance. Very important. So there is obviously, therefore, a close relationship then between man and God, and between nature and man, and a given change in one relation automatically produces a corresponding change in the other. So if you say that God is dead, and the vast majority of people reject the supernatural, and that becomes the overall, the German term Zeitgeist, spirit of the time, then that's what the world becomes, in a sense. It doesn't change, but it is conditioned in as much as that is how people understand things. That is how people understand things. And so if you have this kind of a mind control, now imagine if you can do this in an organized way. And that's what I'm getting at. The human being is a symbolic creature. We often forget this. The human being relates to the world through symbols, whether they are auditory in the form of words or written. There is some kind of a symbolic mediation always. It's not pure concepts. And if you can control words, you can control how people think. And that is what we find today. And this is a kind of, let's make no mistake, this is a kind of magic. This was very well understood by Giordano Bruno. I mean, in the ancient grimoires of Western magic, you have people who are invoking different sorts of angels, demons, all sorts of things. What the great scholar of Western magic and practitioner, Dr. Stephen Skinner, calls spiritual beings. And these Western magicians, when they invoke these spiritual beings and they appear in some form, they want them to do something because magic is a practical science. They bind them. They bind them through the invocation of certain names or through spiritual beings who have a power over them, and that's another subject. And you find similar ideas in Islamic Quranic theurgic practices. Well, it's also possible to bind human beings, and Giordano Bruno wrote a very, very important treatise called On Binding, which is all about how you control people. This was completely forgotten about. It was written about at great length by, what was his name? I always forget him. You always remember, and I always forget this guy. The Romanian, what was his name again? Culianu.
In his book, Eros and Magic in the Renaissance.
Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. And I think he says somewhere that, we have the modern analogs of these kinds of magicians in modern propaganda and advertising. There was this British documentary filmmaker, I forget his name also. He made a 2-3-part documentary called The Age of the Self.
Century of the Self.
Century of the Self, right. Do you remember the name of the guy?
I can search it now.
Right, Century of the Self. It's a 2-3-part. It's pretty long, but it's very educational, very interesting. Talking about the role of
Adam Curtis.
Yes, Adam Curtis. Talking about the role of Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and how this whole idea of public relations gets so big. So if you can control language, if you can control, all these inputs into the human mind, and what do you have people doing today? They're on their devices. They have infinite scroll. They're looking into their phones, just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, or they're plugged into some other digital application or program, and so you have the whole mediation of experience is through digital and artificial means. There's very few people who can completely shut that off. And I am not some sort of a Luddite. I'm not against technology, but wallahi, if it was all gone tomorrow, it really wouldn't matter to me. I think it would matter to a lot of other people, though. And most of us don't do that, but I use it to the degree that I need it. Beyond that, I don't bother with it. It's a means to an end. But for most people, it's become an end in itself.
I think now it is a given, it is accepted, with the rise of all these crazies all over the place, how internet has dumbed down a significant portion of the population. Most people, instead of using it to find correct references and access sources, they just use it to spread idiocy.
They use it to spread idiocy, yes. And then not only that, but I think there is a definite, again, this is the reflection of the macrocosm and the microcosm. The whole degradation of the biosphere. And I'm not just talking about the obvious things like air and water pollution, but there is a kind of electromagnetic pollution with all of these cell phone towers, microwave radiation, all sorts of things, which are highly inimical to all organic, to all life, to all organic, compounds. It's very bad. And I think that has also had an effect on people's physical health, their vitality, but also on the spiritual. So it's not just that they say that the spiritual and the supernatural doesn't exist anymore. But there are, I think, some sort of kind of conscious, whether by design or not, a kind of almost electromagnetic jamming of spiritual frequencies, if that's the right way to say it. And there's so many barriers. Most people cannot just quietly sit in tranquility, and even if you make them shut off all their devices, they are in a state of tremendous anxiety and agitation. They cannot calm themselves down, or their mind is full of all sorts of distractions. There's this guy. I haven't read the book, but I like the title. Somebody wrote a book on Buddhist meditation, and had a very good title. It was just called "Sit Down and Shut Up." But there are very few people who can just sit down and shut up, in the sense of shut down what's going on in their mind and focus and concentrate on something. 30 minutes of that is just impossible. Most people cannot do 30 minutes of meditation. You can forget it. Within 5 minutes, most people today are in trouble. And I also find the pollution. There's so much sound pollution as well. And sound is important. Vibrational frequency. It's very important that one of the key sciences of the quadrivium, they say it's music, but really we should say harmony, sonic harmony. That's really what that is in the quadrivium. There are certain vibrational frequencies which are conducive to human life and to tranquility, and then there are certain frequencies which are not. I mean, everybody knows this. Hence we have terms like noise and racket and commotion and so forth in the English language. In other words, dissonant frequencies and sounds which disturb a human being. Anyone who's trying to sleep can understand that. Or if there are one or two people out there who are actually trying to focus and concentrate on something meaningful, but there is a massive road construction works going on outside their house, and there's jackhammers and and noise is not going to be able to focus. Well, that's very simple. But what is supposed modern music today? It's noise, man. And most people are listening to that all the time. And even if it's not, music has a way of affecting people. And so they always have some sort of music playing wherever you go. The strange thing is that even in bookstores in America, in the bookstore chains like Barnes and Noble, they have music playing, and it's rather loud. Very strange. And so most people are addicted to some form or another of music. And if they don't have their ear pods in and listening on their phone or iPod, and even if you turn it off, it's ringing in their ears all the time. So they can't get that out of it. That's one reason that in tasawwuf and in other theurgic paths and the mystery religions, I think sound was so important, and invocation of the divine name and intonation of sacred texts. You find this with the Quran, you find it with the Vedas, you find even like Sanskrit would be considered sacred language, right? Arabic would be considered sacred language, but even in Japanese, which I don't think they have the notion of a sacred language, but there is beautiful recitation in the Japanese language of things like the Hanya Shingyo, the Heart Sutra, or the Rishikyo, like in Shingon Buddhism. And I've been to Japan, I've been to these monasteries and listened to these beautiful chantings. But where is all of that? You have all this trash which they're calling music. And so people are in a constant state of chaos and dispersion in multiplicity and in phenomena. And they're not able to focus. But there's the whole other sinister level where, they're controlled by language and certain keywords. It's almost as though there's been a kind of mass programming of human beings. And I cannot help but think that that is by design. So I see that as a key form of occult war and occult warfare, where you don't have to do anything. The person has already been turned into a kind of robot or automaton, which is subject to control through this kind of propaganda and mass advertising and mass media. There was a French thinker named Jacques Ellul who wrote a book called The Technological Society, and wrote another one called Propaganda, in which he talks about how modern society, through these means of propaganda, which have been even further enhanced and weaponized by modern technology and modern media, that it creates what he calls the systematic vacuity of the individual. Guénon also in The Reign of Quantity talks about, the mass man, and Julius Evola also says things along these lines. So Ellul calls it the systematic vacuity of the individual, which makes that person subject to control and suggestion by whatever the system deems to be strategically opportune. And so this is the situation that we find ourselves in. And that's why there is so much chaos and everything. It's just like what it says in the Quran. They say that we are peacemakers. إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ. But they're not. They're mufsidun. They're creating chaos in the world. But most people are not even in a position to see that anymore.
And this brings us to an interesting junction. Now, those who are,
yes,
again, then a lot of people, what they do is that they see themselves as we are good and they're looking to play the blame game. Now, who are those who are at fault? Designating sort of human actors to these forces.
Mhm.
This reminds me of some interesting passages from this marvelous book by Wouter Hanegraaff.
Oh, yes. Wouter Hanegraaff.
He has this marvelous book called Esotericism and the Academy, Rejected Knowledge in Western Culture.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are all sorts of conspiracy theories going on these days, and we are both familiar with this ridiculous movement of QAnon, which is
Going on, yeah, all right. Yeah.
well explained. A game designer recently wrote a very learned essay saying how this looks like a video game that is playing people.
A video game playing people, that's what it is, yeah.
So Hanegraaff in this book, do you want to mention some of the passages, or should I just?
Why don't you go ahead, because I don't have the book. I think you've perused, read the book carefully. I don't have a copy. I don't like to read PDFs, and I haven't been able to purchase a copy yet.
So
feel free.
In your other videos, you've talked of how philosophy by the ancients was seen as something quite ancient. All nations had it.
Yes.
And they lived in this sort of golden chain of succession of philosophy, how this sacred wisdom, the Khamire Azali, the perennial leaven, was transformed. Sohrawardi mentions this, that there was a western branch coming from Ambazagles, Empedocles, Hermes.
Hermes, right.
Eastern branch from the major ancient Persian philosopher kings.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was a sacred lineage, this was a sacred golden chain. But it is amusing how, and this was by and large accepted, but even in the 2nd century, there were some Christians, there were some fundamentalists, one can call them Salafi Christians, who said, no, this was a demonic counter-initiation, inspired by the devil, how Zoroaster was a magician, and Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, these were all pagans, these severe anti-Platonic and anti-pagans. And some of them, this is quite amusing, they considered Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to be a second Plato, in a negative sense.
Yeah.
But he says, and eventually, to quote, this anti-Platonic critique resulted in the gradual but inexorable destruction of a great intellectual tradition that had been integral to Christian culture before Reformation. By and large, these were a minority of voices. By and large, these were Protestant, largely German characters who blamed this on the Platonists and Culiano, in his marvelous book, he explains how modern world is a result of that Reformation and counter-Reformation, and Catholics, who were they were supporters of and patrons of Renaissance in their fights with the Protestants. They let go of this tradition and this heritage, and it was forgotten, and the rejection of the imagination, the rejection of these ancient doctrines. But he says on page 207, remarkably, however, the idea that the transmission of secret knowledge required some kind of formal organization does not seem to have occurred to anyone before the early 17th century. They didn't see it necessary for it to be some sort of, on the profane level, always an organization and an actual human-to-human chain.
Yeah.
And he says even the more extreme anti-pagan polemicists discussed in chapter 2 of this work, with their ideas of a heretical counter-tradition inspired by the devil, had not imagined the transmission of ancient wisdom as taking place by means of secret underground organizations.
Yes.
The implications of this novel idea were enormous, not least from a political perspective, for it implied that hidden occult conspiracies might be silently at work to subvert and overthrow the existing order for good or evil, depending on one's perspective. The concept became highly important for the imagination of the occult during the 19th and 20th centuries, from pulp fiction in the genre of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code to the very real politics of paranoia focused on Jewish, Masonic, or Satanist conspiracies and their various combinations. So, as it says, it's the anti-pagan, anti-Platonic narrative that culminated in largely Protestant polemics in 17th century Germany continues in the genre of anti-occultist, anti-Satanist writings popular in Christian, evangelical, and fundamentalist circles.
Indeed.
And I can add that shadows of that continue, you can find them in sort of pulp fiction writings in the Islamic world. They just give it an Islamic varnish. You
Hmm.
find all sorts of people who blame philosophy. They say this is all, or magic. They say this is all Kabbalah.
Yeah.
I saw some people even commenting on your videos, this is haram, this is Kabbalah.
Ridiculous what kind of things you find. And again, and I think that this is very much, it's not exclusive, but I think much of this blame can be laid at the feet of Ibn Taymiyyah and similar currents among Sunni Muslims. This anti-philosophical attitude, this attitude against what I call Quranic theurgy, or you could refer to it as magic, not in Arabic, but magic in English. As I like the definition of magic given by Stephen Skinner in his book on Greco-Egyptian magic. It's a very important book. It's a very academic work where magic involves the achievement of some goal through supernatural means, through what he calls supernatural beings. But there was this kind of opposition on the part of certain people as well. And among Sunnis, really the sort of group thing which is the silver lining there for Sunnis is Sufism. And indeed, most of the people who were involved in these kind of things, talismans and this and that, were Sufis. But also, to be fair, in the Shia world, you have the Akhbaris, who were opposed to these kinds of philosophy as well. And then you have a kind of later day tendency along those lines, an anti-philosophical, anti-Sufism, Irfan tendency, which I think is mainly in Iran. At least its name is Persian, the Maktab-e-Tafkik, the people who want to cut off, so to speak, philosophy completely from the Shia tradition. And you find some people also in the West who come from this Protestant evangelical background who are right about certain things, but have this weird attitude when it comes to these kind of esoteric doctrines from the ancient world. And then, you really wonder, have they unwittingly allowed themselves, to be made fools of? Because when you say some things which are correct, but then at the same time you maintain things which are completely ridiculous. An outstanding example is flat earthism, for example, or a belief in some sort of alien extraterrestrial. I mean, I'm not scientifically, it's quite possible that there's life on other worlds, and it's quite possible that maybe they have come here and so forth. But to say that there's this massive conspiracy and the government is involved in Area 51, this is all very weird. I mean, there was a strange announcement recently by the head of the Mossad that the U.S. government has been involved with aliens for decades, right? And so, and of course, when someone from the Mossad or some other intelligence agency makes these kind of statements, you have to wonder. These are people who are in the business of lying, right? They're in the business of manipulation. So whenever some sort of statement is made, you have to really, really, really wonder. But then there's also all sorts of distractions and so forth that are involved. So they get people to go out and demonstrate about this thing or that thing, when in the end it's not going to change anything. I mean, the overall flow is going to continue the way it is. And it's a way of dissipating those energies so that the actual powers that be remain in power. But that's a very interesting statement by Hanegraaff. I wasn't aware of that.
Most of the activists, they can become easily guilty of that. Geron has a very nice chapter, Contemplation versus Action. I think is it in Crisis of Modern World or Reigns of Quantity?
Regardless of where it is, I don't know, but I mean, it's a persistent theme in his writing, contemplation versus action.
All of these people says, what is to be done? As Lenin said, and before him, was it Chernyshevsky?
Yeah.
Always forget his name.
Could be, What
And
is
these are the people who blame. And we find them in, all of these modern Islamic movements, they always blamed those who were people of contemplation, who emphasized the importance, the priority of internal work.
Mhm, mhm.
And we can see the result of how most of these movements, they've just become bashriyun. There's just a facade has remained, and in their actions, personally, I don't see any difference between them and those whom they blame.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the whole notion of of regeneration versus regression comes up in the whole relationship between microcosm, and also history and the profanation of the moment. And we mentioned this very early on, and maybe we can bring things to a close on this point. So with the procession, so to speak, of the cycle and its inexorable movement toward dissolution and destruction, it's recognized that there can be individual acts of resistance, so to speak, not against the entire flow, but within oneself. And so with this kind of profane historical time, you can either allow yourself to fall into that and drown in it, or you can learn to swim against the current, so to speak, or to somehow extricate yourself from it. Evola talked about riding the tiger, and he has a book with that title as a guide for living in the Kali Yuga for aristocrats of the soul, or something to that effect in the subtitle. And that's, I think, one of his most difficult books, and I would be, very few people will understand what is written there. There's all these allusions to Nietzsche and modern philosophy and this and that. These are not easy writers. And it's a very difficult sort of thing because, Evola was very strange in the sense that, unlike Genon, he didn't advocate following any particular traditional religion. And I think Genon is unique among these traditionalist writers, unique in that he actually properly entered Islam. Shuan never really did. He's a complete deviant. Evola is Evola. He's off on his own thing, very unique thing. Marco Pallas was a Tibetan Buddhist. Who else is there? A.K. Kumaraswamy was, I think, a Buddhist, although, I think his mother was British, so I think maybe he may have been raised Anglican. But his son, Rama Kumaraswamy, was a Catholic. Then you have all these people who congregated around Shuan, who entered Islam in some sense or another, but they were following him, so you really wonder. But Genon actually entered Islam. I had the good fortune of meeting Genon's son when I lived in Cairo. He's buried in Muslim cemetery, so on and so forth. So riding the tiger or somehow reversing, what I would say is that you have this continual profanation of the moment, so to speak, if you allow yourself to enter into history. What do I mean by that? If you actually allow yourself to be overwhelmed by this. And so the only way that you can really encounter the end of the Kali Yuga, because we may not live until that time. And in the Islamic understanding of things, the end of the Kali Yuga is the coming of the Mahdi. And if you want to experience the coming of the Mahdi, you may live to that time and you may not live to that time. So the only way to do it is to get out of history, to transcend history, the historical process itself of temporal succession, and to somehow get yourself out of it. You cannot allow yourself to be those who are, who are drowned in the river Nile. So the Fir'aun, was a figure in profane in the sense of mundane history of the temporal flow of events. Now, who he was, we can debate about that. Was it Ramses II or whoever? It doesn't matter. But the Pharaoh that was there in the time of Musa alayhi salam, or Moses, and he sought to drown all the firstborn. because he knew that his enemy was going to be born. So you cannot allow yourself to be drowned in the sea of temporal succession. You have to somehow build an arc for yourself and reverse that emotion. And of course, that is through the invocation of the divine name. It is through the practices of and the contemplative disciplines which you find in Sufism, especially the more internal means of contemplation, because there's the outward dhikr, there's what's called al-dhikr al-jahri, zikr al-jahri, which is sort of out loud, and then there's a sort of involution of that as well. It becomes quieter and quieter, and it resembles the internal arts of the Taoists, that and it becomes a kind of breath control, which in Sufi tariqas in the Persianate world they call it passe anfas, right? A kind of breath control of the dam. Dam is the Persian word for breath, very important. And well, that's all I can really say about it. So there is a kind of reversal, and if that happens, you bring about, so to speak, the coming of the Mahdi within you, so to speak, the rising of the Imam. All of these events of historical time, of sacred history, have to transpire within. And there was very interesting writings on this by a Sufi from the Persianate, from the Iranian world, the large Iranian world, is Alauddin Simnani. And he wrote about these things, and really in the English language there's very little, but the people who did write about it were people like Henri Corbin in The Man of Light, Iranian Sufism. There's Jamal Ilyas, he wrote a book called The Throne Carrier of God about Alauddin Simnani. And then the actual practice of this meditation, these kind of things, are found in the writings of an American Sufi teacher whom I had the great good fortune of knowing for many, many years, Abdullah Nuruddin Durki. In his book, The Orisons, he has a very brief but I think important explanation of that called the Muraqaba, the circulation of the light. And it's very similar to contemplative disciplines in his understanding of things, which we find in certain Taoist schools, and which are set out in a very important text translated by Thomas Cleary called The Secret of the Golden Flower. So in that sense, then, you bring about the coming of the Moses of your being, the Noah of your being, the Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam of your being, the Mahdi of your being, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ. And there has come unto them a prophet from among themselves. Again, this is another thing which a lot of the sort of Salafist kind of Muslims have a huge problem with, because they have really turned Islam into a kind of evangelical Protestantism of some sort. And the more unbalanced of them have gone in all sorts of violent directions, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of these insane tendencies, which have connections with the West as well on a certain level, but that's a whole other topic. The great Sufi poet of Egypt, Omar ibn al-Farid, said in his famous poem of the Way, rhyming in the letter Ta, إلي نبيا كنت مني مرسلا وذاتي بآياتي علي استدلتي. Beautiful verse, but kind of hard to translate.
I think it's إلي رسولا.
Yeah, I said رسولا. إلي رسولا رسولا كنت, because it's going to be the خبر كان. إلي رسولا كنت مني مرسلا. To myself, a prophet I was sent. وذاتي بآياتي, and myself with my portents, the signs within, pointed back to me. وذاتي بآياتي علي استدلتي. And that's an allusion to the verse of the Quran in Surah Fussilat, which says, سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. And we shall show them our signs on the horizons, as to say in the external world, in historical time as well, and within themselves, the inner dimension, وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ, until it becomes manifestly clear unto them that he is the truth, or that it is the truth. So that is the way back. That is the way out. And if you live until that time, mashallah, hopefully you will be on the right side of things. The right side, literally, of sacred history. Or you won't.
Before we finish, may I add another thing?
Please.
Since we discussed conjunctions.
Oh, yes.
Nizami, I have to point out this excellent Ph.D. thesis by Owen Cornwall. He wrote it for Columbia University, yes, in 2016. It's called Alexander and the Persian Cosmopolis, AD 1000 to 1500.
Mm-hmm.
And there he discusses, because as the conjunction is coming, there was this idea of Lord of Conjunction. Sort of king, philosopher, king, priest, king, who sort of took on the energies of such a time and affected great change in the world. And as he, to quote him, he says, Nizami was the first author to use the title Sahib Quran, Lord of the Conjunction.
Yeah.
It comes at a crucial moment in the narrative during which Alexander attains prophethood. Now, for those who do not know Alexander, Muslims by and large consider Alexander to be Zulqarnain mentioned in the Quran.
Until modern times, yeah, you're right.
Nizami
like an ijma, or a kind of consensus, especially in the Persian literary tradition, that, and even a lot of tafsir writers, commentators on the Quran, were of the view that the two-horned one mentioned in the 18th surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, the chapter of the cave, the two-horned one was none other than Alexander the Great.
There's no disagreement here. While Nizami considers Alexander to have been a Nabi, people like Amir Khosrow Dehlavi, they say no, he wasn't a Nabi, but he had Valayat in the meaning of the Akbarian meaning.
He had proximity or sanctity or sainthood. Yeah.
To resume quote, it may even have been connected to Alexander's title Zulqarnain, for Qiran, conjunction, and Qarn, horn, yoke, come from the same Arabic quote. Nizami translates Zulqarnain as Sahib Duqarn, Lord of Two Horns, before referencing Abu Ma'shar's Uluf, as indication that Nizami connected both titles with astrological significance. And the actual verse is Degargune Guyad Jahan Filsuf Abu Ma'shar under Kitab Uluf. He calls Abu Ma'shar Jahan Filsuf, the world philosopher, in his Kitab Uluf. And the earliest usage of the term in historical texts is AD 1204 by the historian Ravandi, that is Najmuddin Ravandi, to describe his patron, the Seljuk ruler of Konya, Kay Khosrow ibn Ghalich Arsalan, in Rahat al-Sudur, Ayat al-Sudur. The hearts. Yes. So the first person that we know of in historical writings was referred to as having this title, Sahib Gharan, Kay Khosrow ibn Ghalich Arsalan. But Ravandi was...
what time was he? Do you know the year, death date?
He writes this 1204, AD 1204.
AD 1204, right. So that's the 600s. That's the 7th. That's very interesting. All right.
Ravandi was an avid reader of Nizami. By one count, Ravandi quoted Nizami's poetry more than 249 times in his history. And the current dating of completion of Nizami's Iskandarnameh is 1194, over 10 years before Ravandi's usage of the title. Mm-hmm. So he says Ravandi took this from Nizami. And after him, this term increases. The proliferation of the term in the century after Nizami illustrates the transregional phenomenon of medieval Persian kingship. In the 13th century, a number of rulers refer to themselves as Alexander Sahib Gharan. In addition to the aforementioned Ghiyathuddin Kay Khosrow, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria Baybars I, the Mamluk, who defeated the Mongols in the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, styled himself in Arabic as Iskandar al-Zaman Sahib al-Gharan. Furthermore, the famous Ilkhanid historian Al-Juwayni develops this concept and establishes a new historical paradigm in which a Sahib Gharan emerges for each age. And of course, he mentions his patron, Monka Khan, as and of course, this continues, and the most famous Sahib Gharan that we have is Taimur Lane. And then we find this title in other rulers such as Shah Jahan referred to himself as Sahib Quran Sani, but he referred to the conjunction of Jupiter and Venus.
Interesting.
And so
Akbar, by
Nizamuddin
the
was,
way, also in India, he had a whole, in his biography, which was written for him, he was portrayed as the Sahib Quran as well. And I'm almost certain that those are fake horoscopes. They give actual horoscopes for his nativity, and Allah knows. And
yeah.
you know, Suleiman of Sultan Suleiman in Turkey, they've all claimed to be Sahib Quran. Yeah.
And Iskandar Sani or Suleiman Sani. So there was this idea, and all of Nizami is at the center of it, this idea of this sacred Persian kingship and this universal kingship, which had no ties to dynastic birth, but rather to the attainment of spiritual and philosophical distinction.
Interesting.
So to conclude, we can only hope and ask if this conjunction will bring about, who knows?
It's very hard to know. It's very hard to know because we're living at this point in the Kali Yuga when you really don't have any kingship. I mean, those Germans who call themselves the House of Windsor are just a complete joke. And, you know, compared to these other Western monarchs and so forth, I mean, this is all just nonsense. So one really wonders what it means. I hope that it is a good portent. There's all sorts of people making predictions, but I really don't give any credence to them, and we'll know soon enough, I suppose. But this is really interesting what you've brought up, and I think we may have mentioned this before also, but just, again, in case people who didn't see that one, there's value in repeating these things. There's a really interesting study of that, which, you know, we've both read, called The Millennial Sovereign, which is a fascinating book that looks at this notion of the Lord of the Conjunction. And when I just realized that when we say, you know, Dhul Qarnayn, you know, the two-horned one, you could presumably argue on the basis of Arabic root morphology that it's referring to the Lord of the two conjunctions, or the two things which become conjunct, maybe Jupiter and Saturn. I don't know. That's just an intuition or a guess, or, you know, or a hypothesis I would like to put out there. And there's also, we might as well mention this as well, and then probably we'll conclude. So that root, Qaf, Ra, Nun, right, from which you get Qarn, which is horn, and then you get Qiran, which is conjunction, or for two things to coincide. Well, if you write out the word Qiran, Qaf, Ra, Alif, Nun in Arabic, in English transliteration, that would be Qiran, and you would put a line, a macron above the A to indicate the long vowel. If you change the voweling in Arabic and put a dhamma over the qaf, you get Quran. Quran, right? So I think that's very interesting. And you also have the notion of qareen in Arabic, which is the notion of the jinnic twin or doppelganger. And I actually spoke a little bit about this on a recent interview with Glitch Bottle podcast, but I didn't get into what I'm going to say now. There are many hadiths that talk about the Imam, right? And of course, the end of the Kali Yuga, as far as we're concerned, is going to be with the coming of the Imam, the 12th Imam. But in 12-er Shīʿah doctrine, each of these Imams is on a certain esoteric level equivalent to one another. There is some notion that, you know, Imam Ali alayhi salam is above, and he's the only one who can be referred to as the commander of the faithful, or the prince of the believers, the title Amirul Mu'mineen. And of course, they don't have prophethood; they are manifestations of walaya. But there are many, many hadiths that indicate that Imam Ali is, you know, al-Qur'anu ma'ali wa Ali ma'al Qur'an, for example. The Qur'an is with Ali and Ali is with the Qur'an. And there's this idea also that the whole Ahlul Bayt are an extremely precious and weighty thing. So the famous hadith when Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Inni tarikun fikum ath-thaqalain," I'm leaving behind me in your midst the two precious or weighty things, Kitabullah, which is the Quran, and then the Ahlul Bayt. So I would argue then that the Ahlul Bayt are the qareen of the Quran, so to speak. And there's a kind of conjunction between a kind of identity between the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. And it's no accident then that, these esoteric practices and Sufism and contemplative disciplines all involve extensive recitation of the Quran with the right, sonic frequencies and tajweed. And that too is something which reverses that historical dissolution and the profanation of time and facilitates the internalization of the invocation and the dhikr in the upward flow, so to speak, of the arc of ascent, as it's called, al-Qaws as-Su'udi, and the journey back to the one, which ultimately is the flight of the alone to the alone. Wallahu a'lam.